What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatmas, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Markus Iofecea, and he is a future archaeologist. So with his clients, he goes into the future, finds artifacts, and then creates new worlds, and therefore, or thereby, innovation. A fascinating exploration conversation that you cannot miss. So turn off all the distractions around you to have your full focus on this beautiful conversation. And scroll down to the show notes to find more information and links, and to click on the subscribe button if you enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for listening. Markus, welcome to the show.
Miriam, so nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm very curious. When I saw your title on LinkedIn, Future Archaeologist, I could not reach out to learn more about your work.
It's been a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. We had such a good pre-discussion also.
Yes, this could have been a podcast recording. And I feel so bad now because I say it so often, and as an audience, I'm like, do you feel FOMO that you're not included in all these amazing conversations we have when we are off record? Let's start with at the beginning. I always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I think I never really called myself a facilitator, although the amounts of workshops or events where I facilitated pretty much balance out with the amounts of workshops that I probably attended as a participant, but I don't really carry the label with me.
Mm. And you do carry the label of the future archaeologist.
Yes, it's a made-up one.
Yes, and I love made-up ones, and it fits perfectly with my newest venture and curiosity of unprofessionalism, right? Because if we don't have the titles that are so professional, air quotes, then they allow us to break free and to bring a new perspective and a new way of working. So maybe for those who didn't have the opportunity to have a pre-conversation with you, maybe you can explain what a future archaeologist is and how you got to that label. And we take it from there.
Yes. So a future archaeologist generally looks at the future as like a huge archaeological field where you can dig in different spots. You can dig over there, and then the other day you go there and dig there, and you never know what you will find. And you basically can think of it as digging in different futures. So you accept the fact that the future is not written in stone. All kinds of things can happen. And so you're digging. And with digging, I mean, you use your imagination, your creativity. You can be courageous, bold to try and see what you find. And you find little artifacts from which, when you look at them and you ask yourself, what will these people in the future have done with these things? What is this? The world starts to build from the artifact, right? So my work doesn't start with me building a scenario by making things that exist bigger, faster, more sustainable. But I don't have a world at the start. I have something that can happen as a starting point. And from there, the process starts. This artifact is the foundation, basically, also of the discussions. And I try to stay in these futures as long as possible to try to learn about those worlds and not to think about how is this possible? Because today, we have limitations, be it either from a technology perspective, from a regulatory perspective, or how far society has come. So I try to stay in these other societies that don't exist yet.
And I love that so much. And what comes to my mind as you say that today we have restrictions, and that's why you want to stay in the future world as long as possible. When I look at the speed of how fast technology is developing, and regulation, not so much, but I think at some point it has to catch up. And I'm reading this book a lot of books at the moment about AI and how everything is developing so fast. I think once you're done with exploring your future and artifact, the present will have caught up anyway,
So
in one way or another.
That would be amazing. But you bring up a very good point when you say technology develops in a different speed than regulations. What I feel, looking also a little bit into the recent past, I mean, maybe the last 100 to 200 years, I think that gap somehow widened, and I feel like this acceleration of technological development and regulations not catching up, or people who are used to work in a good tempo, not going to work for the regulator or the government, is something where I'm a little bit concerned, to be honest. Yeah.
The widening gap, and that then we're basically lost in this uncertainty, you mean, where there's something at hand that we are using, but it's in this intermediate liminal space that is not regulated and maybe not the new norm?
I think this is a potential outcome, and we see it especially with certain technologies like AI now. But for me, it's more, and I probably have to think a lot more about this before I would write about it, but I can say maybe my thought here. I wonder if we see a shift in power, like in the past, the regulator could set the boundaries very well, the government or the kings before that.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to ask myself, who's driving where we're going now, Because if the one is lost in the dust, behind, they will not be asked anymore, right? And so as a question, I wonder, do we or shall we try to close that gap again?
And can we?
And can we?
And I'm very aware that we are going on a tangent.
Yes.
And this might indeed be a risk if we are creating facts just because we can. And I think when we look at politics at the moment, politics, there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
Where facts are created just because the means are available, and where there is purely no time for bureaucracy to catch up with the speed. So I think we do have to look at different ways to process that.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, let me try to build a bridge back to our topic. Do we observe the same then in organizations where if you're a future archaeologist, you're imagining a future. You're picking out a artifact, and I would like to dig deeper into can you give an example of this artifact that you're finding? And then you're exploring this, and then at some stage you will see how do we connect it to the present. Mm-hmm. And that's how innovation happens, I imagine.
So that's a super cool arc you found. What I am observing is that in many innovation contexts in organization, technology is the primary driver. So people look at hype cycles, they look at trend reports, they read things like, again, now this podcast would probably be different in 5 years, but now AI, right? Mm-hmm. And so the question is always, Markus, what can we do with AI? Mm-hmm. But that means basically you start from now and what AI can do now, and you think, well, what can we do in our corporate context with this thing? Exactly.
It's very narrow.
It's very narrow. And with future archaeology, AI as a word doesn't really play a role at first. So you start to wonder what if questions. For example, you wonder, what if I want to listen to music or a podcast about a specific thing? Let's say your context that you're creating with your podcast, but you don't know about it. And this podcast suddenly comes in the perfect form on the perfect media for you at the right time. Or you want to read a book and, this book knows, oh, Miriam wants to read me. And it's like, hey, I'm here. And then you start from there and you think like, okay, if this can happen in the world, I can look at this now and say, okay, what would an artifact look like? That we can talk about that. But basically you create it and you play with this, and then you start to realize things. For example, in such a world, maybe the search is over, right? So There's no more search engine where I need to look for a book. Maybe you don't need like a web front, like an Amazon store or similar, obviously, because they're just an intermediary that connect a non-intelligent book or non-smart book with you so that you can find it. But now it breaks away and so on and so forth. And when you go through this for hours and hours or weeks and weeks, you will find out if you think this is desirable for you in your corporation, what you do in your business, you will find what you would do with AI. You would, for example, say, if you produce services, you would say, oh, maybe I should make a smart product, a product that I can talk to or my clients can talk to. And then you look at what can AI do now and you get a feeling, how can a version 1 be? But you would already have a vision. You would not just start with what can I do? Because maybe you would have never come to this point if you would just take your current platform and say, what can I do? Let's say you are a web shop. And now you make with AI some suggestions better, or you cut jobs here and there, or, but maybe you would have never come to the point to say, what if we have smart products, right?
What intrigues me is that somehow when I listen to you, my entire mind relaxes and, it gets tickled because I get very excited about this what if scenario. And what it feels like is that we can then stop running after catching up. Because if we develop a product that is constructed to what we can do today, we know for sure, as a matter of fact, tomorrow it will be able to do more. So we are constantly updating the product so that it catches up with the new status quo. Whereas when we have designed for something in the future, then it's only, today we can come one step closer to it instead of running after. So it's it puts us in control.
Exactly,
to
right.
some extent.
Yes, it puts us in control and we can shape that future within that context that we're moving in. And the other way that you just described, when I transfer this to what I see in organizations, is this huge hype to be an agile organization. It's something that I hear left and right,
Mm-hmm.
And it is a good form to be organized in an agile way, but it's completely different if you walk agile towards the future and you adapt to if something in the world changes, then you have no idea. It's a thick fog. You walk through the fog. You don't know if like in 1.5 meters, there's a huge cliff that you'll fall down. And all you can do is react to the next stone that you see. Yeah. And we can call it either catch up or evade, but basically it's a survival tactics. And I think you can use agile for both, either as a survival tactics or, for me, better way to pursue a bigger goal.
Yeah. Yeah. And what also comes to my mind is two things. One is uncertainty is the biggest threat for our nervous system.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, uncertainty triggers all these fight, flight, freeze. And I think we haven't come out of this fight, flight, freeze overwhelm of uncertainty since the beginning of VUCA in the early 2000s, right? Yeah. So that's a long time that we're just stressed out. And so how might we overcome that uncertainty? Well, by just picking a random future and working towards it, because a random future is as likely as an unknown future. So why not just betting on one? And correct me if I misunderstand you and just making things up. But the second thing that also comes to my mind is I listened to a podcast with a brain scientist who said that how important it is to the law of attraction, how important it is, independent of all the woo-woo talk. But if we tell our brain what we want to achieve in the future and we reaffirm it every day, our brain will make sure that we get there, right? By finding the breadcrumbs. So, yeah, I'm so in love with your method because it makes so much sense on so many levels.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This law of attraction, self-fulfilling prophecy, all these kind of effects that it can have are amazing. Also for employees, if you go through the revolving door in the morning and you badge in, I use this now symbolically, and your team, your company is walking through a thick fog, it feels also psychologically weird. You're like, you can come to the point to say, why am I doing? Like, for what are we doing what we're doing? Even though they may do amazing things with now AI or whatever, right? So they think we are busy. We're like, but they know exactly, don't know where they want to go. Now, the only thing that in my context, I wouldn't say when it comes to uncertainty is pick a random one. I think explore random ones, but pick one that feels right for what you want to do. One that you say, I think this would be amazing if we would do that. If we can achieve that, all these things will be possible. And if you can communicate it also to the people in the organization, I think the next time they walk through that revolving door in the morning, badge in, is probably different, right? And you are absolutely right. I think people who work in an environment where they know towards what they're working is better. It's better for our brain,
Yeah. And I'm very curious now, how do you pick the desired future? Yeah. So what is because there are a billion, there are possible futures that you can pick from. Even if you are just an organization developing a product, what would you need to first develop the different possible, so to dream really big? What do you need in terms of mindsets, but also people? Because I assume you need very different perspectives. It's not just the CEO going into a state of dreaming.
Yes. So how I practice it in this, again, made up term, future archaeology, and maybe I should write a book one day.
Yes, please.
About this. I don't pick a world. So I dig in these different futures, which again, in the beginning are not worlds, they're an artifact, right? Like,
how do you define artifact in this context?
It's a thing that happens in the world, or a thing that exists in a world.
That someone could dig out in the even further future.
Yes. And also really like a normal archaeologist who digs out a piece of ceramics or a metal piece. It's really this metal piece is the start. What is it? Is it part of a weapon? Is it part of a spoon or something they ate with? And then the world builds. And then I learn a lot about that artifact and that world, but it doesn't necessarily have to do anything with me later as a company. So I try to understand that artifact. And then what happens if we look at the whole process of future archaeology, I take that artifact out of its context at some point. And now I place it in different worlds. And this is where then scenarios could come in play. And just to completely simplify now for the sake of this podcast, I would play with variables. I would say, okay, so this artifact that I found that can do these and these things, let's say with this, like this, with the songs or books, would this work in a world that has no democracy? Yes or no? In this case, probably yes. Is this thing affected by, let's say, climate change of 1.5 degrees versus 2.5 degrees versus 5 degrees? Probably not. It works in both. Is this affected by, does the world need to have money or not? Probably also not. And the more of these things this artifact withstands, the more I would call it personally in future archaeology, I would call it a robust thing. Not a robust future, but a robust thing that can happen in many futures, because I acknowledge that I cannot know the future. So what I need for the company is something that they could say, probably no matter what happens, which is never true. All kinds of crazy things can happen that you never thought of, but you've thought of so many things, not just one scenario or four, that you would say, if I bet on this thing, that we will try to accomplish this, we don't know how yet, probably, and now no matter what, in quotes, happens, we will succeed with it because it doesn't depend on this or that. And this is a little bit contrary to when you build a scenario, which is fixed, which is really hard to build if you really want to predict the world, especially if you talk about the 2050s, for example, and you say, there's also a persona, I don't know, Sophia, 35, single, lives in New York, loves cooking, and you build a solution for that in that scenario. What if that scenario doesn't materialize, right? So what companies then do is they create many, many scenarios. And I think it's probably the most costly way of trying to explore uncertainty, if you ask me.
It sounds like we are forcing control onto something that is uncontrollable just
Yes.
to calm down our nervous system.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then very interesting conversations come out of what you describe, because when you describe this artifact of the book or the music that comes to you, my mind immediately went into, it's like, who is deciding? So would it work in a non-democratic environment? Yes, it would, but it would be pure manipulation because someone is deciding what I will read and what I will listen to. Is this something desirable? And is this something that we want to pursue? Or what are the alternatives?
This is perfect, by the way, if I may, just for 1 second, because you say here the perfect thing. And my biggest learning when I started working out this method of thinking about the future is in these contexts or workshops, when you talk about that, these things that you say come immediately. So we start to philosophically ask interesting question about an idea. And we can try then to find out the desirability. And this is so beautiful that you say that, because you're absolutely right that the desirability, depending on how you change a parameter, can change. That you can say, shall I even birth this into the world? Because it could become this huge monster, or does the benefit outweigh things? Then the control aspect also can immediately come out. And you were saying earlier, what kind of team members would you need, or people in the workshop? If you have now someone from, let's say, behavioral psychology, they could say there's the paradox of choice. Some people are super happy with getting always the perfect thing. They would always, even today, would say, yes, just let's find this auto insurance. I'll take it. And there's the other end of the spectrum, which is, I want to compare 18 and I want to decide. And in the perfect implementation of this now made up idea, it would know that Miriam would feel comfortable if she gets 5 podcasts or books suggested. Maybe Marcus wants to see just one. And this other person, Sophia, she wants to see 35. Right? But we can have the discussion before we implemented a single line of code.
Yeah.
That's the magic, Miriam. Exactly what you just did. I want to see these questions pop up.
Yeah, and it's and I will voice one more thought that came up, which then leads to a different question. So what I then find interesting, okay, so how can we determine, so what is it about Marcus, Miriam, and Sophia that one likes one choice, one likes 5, and the other one in abundance? And what kind of information do we need about them to derive this preference? Which then helps us really understand our customers and how we might put them into buckets. So what I can see is an amazing kind of philosophical round. I would love to host these conversations, right? Because this is my dream conversation. And how do you make sure that you're not drifting into, and maybe that's desirable, that you go in all the tangents, but I assume you have a sponsor, you have someone who pays for this innovative work and would like to have an output at some point that you decide this is the artifact or this is the future that we will focus on. So how do you make sure that you're not philosophizing?
So one thing is very important if someone wants to really indulge in a process to fully understand an artifact, I think they would need to make the time for exactly this space, like you just said, almost like fireside chats. And they should go on for as long as possible to really determine for the context the desirability. To the best of their ability. There's never a desirability that is positive for everyone on planet Earth, right? That is in itself a philosophical problem. But to figure out this desirability before thinking about how to implement it on this level, I think is fundamentally important for me. And then what I do as a next step when we say, okay, in generally, I think this would be amazing if we would make this happen. You know, by the way, also companies can say, we won't have the power to make this happen, but now that we know of it, we can steer our strategy that if it happens, we're ready,
we're
right?
Prepared, yeah.
We're prepared, which is for some companies, by the way, already very valuable to have something more to prepare for in this VUCA or uncertain future, right? So that can be one outcome, right? But the others who want to say, you know, I am a company, I want to create a future in my sector. And this can be insurance, this can be automotive, banking, whatever. what I do then is, okay, let's deconstruct it now. So I call this reverse engineering of time, which in a scenario planning, there's an equivalent, which is called backcasting.
Mm-hmm.
So you go from the future backwards. What should happen a year before? What should happen a year before? And so you end up in the present and you know where to start.
Mm-hmm.
The reverse engineering of an artifact, because it's scenario independent now, is more like an engineering reverse engineering when you take apart a phone or a DVD player and you try to figure out the parts. So I try to figure out the parts of this. Let's call this thing for the rest maybe of this podcast now, this invention. It is something new, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's an invention. Let's look at what are the logical components of it. What do we need? What is it built upon? What's the foundational basis of it?
Mm-hmm.
And that is very important for companies to understand. What are the components? Now coming
They're
also
independent of the
independent of will it be in a democracy or not, right? What are the components? Who will this thing touch? Yeah, the regulator, it will touch this, that. And then when it comes to technology, will this thing need AI? In this case, probably yes. Will this thing need blockchain? Maybe. So you suddenly know a little bit more if you say, I want to go in this direction. What is even of interest to me in my corporation now? Because if you take those hype cycles or trend reports, there's so much that actually most of it is probably noise. And with this, you can find out, okay, when or if I want to do this with my company, I just need to pay attention to these 18 things. And then you can streamline just on those 18 things, no matter what is happening outside. So I try to really deconstruct the artifact basically and bring it to the present.
Yeah. This makes a lot of sense because then it remains independent of the scenario, as you said.
Yeah.
And you can also check, okay, are we there yet?
Yes. And can we get there?
Yeah.
Do we have the capabilities or do we need to build in a unit or,
And then the agility becomes very different because the moment you see, okay, so technology took a different route. Oh, so now that we are going in this direction, what does it mean for our artifact and our planned future?
Mm-hmm. And this is for me how change comes, I think.
And I was just imagining these salons where instead of a strategy offsite where everything is stressed and sticky and you have to decide on a strategy and all the plans, the leadership team goes on an offsite and just enjoys these salon discussions.
That would be like if this would happen on a larger scale, this would be amazing, Miriam.
Yeah.
This would be amazing. These salons. And by the way, these kind of like philosophical salons, I think they existed early 20th century in big cities, Yeah. And I think it's a pity they don't exist anymore. And
I wonder whether they will re-emerge just as a counter, as a counter effect to everything becoming even faster. And at some point you realize that it's so fast, it's out of control anyway. So why not taking more time for the interesting, meaningful, pleasurable, deep thinking?
Yes.
And one question that remains in my head. So before all of that, where's the starting point? Is the starting point a problem, a future problem, a desired future, or simply the post-mortem, we might end up like Kodak? How can we avoid that?
This is very difficult to answer. I think from a principle, it should not start with a desired future. I think if you start with a desire, what you think is a desired future is probably a future or some kind of bias you have, right? So in future archaeology, this artifact is at first neutral. You found it and you're like, oh, what is this? Right? Before you say good or bad. So you stay as long as possible in this non-judgmental good or bad. That's one. Then to the point of, shall it start with a problem? Maybe not, but it can start. And I think that would be very valid for many companies to say, what if they anticipate a problem, right? It hasn't happened yet, but something funky smells in the air when it comes to the future of a specific sector, right? And there are maybe smart people in that context who say, I really think something can happen here. It hasn't materialized. That could be a start point.
Yeah. But a major disruption, right? So
I think then it's too late already.
But if we think of it, so for instance,
if we think of a disruption, yes.
As you mentioned, at the moment we have platforms like Amazon or Spotify.
Yeah.
What if the major disruption is that we don't need these platforms anymore, as you described?
Yeah, right.
And then Amazon goes like, okay, so apparently we're not needed anymore. What do we find that would be? So their starting point could be, what is an artifact that we found in the future that would show us that Amazon didn't exist anymore?
In its role now as being the marketplace, right? To say, look at my storefront. Here are so many books and toasters and whatever else. Because they could then pivot their strategy over the next couple of years to say, maybe we are the company, and basically, I mean, they are a super tech company, right? They could actually be the company who say, we will make every book and every toaster, we put it on the net, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they could seriously, like, this company could be that company that actually can
disrupt itself,
cannibalize itself, and bring us into a world where we don't need to look for a toaster anymore, but the perfect toaster or 5 toasters would find us, right?
Yeah.
So you are absolutely right. So if a company like Amazon would smell this as a disruption or potential disruption, that would be an amazing starting point to build this artifact and say, and analyze it for desirability, play with, feedback from many, many, many different people, and then say, okay, let's streamline our platform, or let's get rid of our platform.
Yeah. And it's so funny. I observe my brain just going in all these directions. Then we're like, oh, so this would mean we need Industry 4.0, because then our kitchen items need to communicate with each other. So I need to know that I need a new toaster, and maybe I have too much bread in my fridge. So it's almost unstoppable once you start this process.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe I'm strange. Maybe my brain functions differently than others. But this is where I immediately go.
This is the best outcome that can happen, I think, in a future archaeological process, or when I work with people. If exactly what happens to you now happens to people in this workshop, right?
Yeah.
If like you would be like a perfect candidate in such a discussion, for example, because I think if you have a constellation of people who can take a thing and build their own, in German, we have this term Kopfkino. I think there's not a real one-to-one translation to English, but basically a movie starts in your head already. And it can be super different for you than for me, than for someone else who's sitting there. And because we all have this different movie, we will probably have an amazing discussion because we can share the movies. We had the Kopfkinos.
Yeah. Yeah. As long as we are not attached. And I think that's also the beauty if we disentangle the artifact from the scenarios.
Yes.
And it's something that hasn't happened yet. We are not attached to it. So we can discuss and observe it from a much more objective perspective.
Yeah, because we can put ourselves imaginatively in that world. It might help us to imagine how it would feel if I don't have to, let's come back to this art. What if I don't have to go and open a streaming service, a movie streaming service, and have to scroll 30 minutes to finally find something I want to watch? Because and how would it be if this goes away? Would I like that? And you can go through a Kopfkino and things change, right?
Yeah. And so this is something maybe also for the audience, they might now think, yeah, this sounds nice, but who would pay for that? So you have actually done that. You have worked for a company that paid for it and was willing to lean into this experiment, into this very innovative process to approach innovation.
Yes. First of all, that, and maybe also for the audience, I did this professionally for 9 years at a major corporation. Then afterwards, now I'm a future archaeologist on my own, so to say. The level of how far the engagement in this process that we just talked about goes really heavily depends on the client now. But there's also something, and maybe for a discussion at a very later point, Miriam, if our paths cross again, I'm also working on my own future archaeological artifact right now. It's just that I cannot yet, like at this point of the recording, I cannot talk about it publicly right now. Yeah. But I'm doing one myself now, not for someone else.
Fascinating. So you're basically designing your future, innovating your future, applying your own method.
Yes.
That's beautiful. And it reminds me how the design thinking method at some point was used for designing your life.
Mm-hmm. I didn't mean designing my life. I'm working on a future artifact in a specific sector where I think I found one of these disruptions, and I found an artifact that can make it happen, where I'm currently in the phase of understanding more about it. It's not yet ready to, so I didn't write a LinkedIn article or anything about it because it's not yet at the stage where I say, now I want to share it with the rest of the world. So it's not for my life, but if this works out, I would like to spend my life on this topic. Let's put it that way. But I can also miserably fail. And I've seen while I was doing it professionally, how certain artifacts, they can fall apart, right? They're not a guarantee that the first thing you find when you dig in a future will also be something that will survive the next couple of iterations of thinking about it and reverse engineering. So, yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense. So it is the prototyping stage.
Yes.
And then, okay, there was one thought that I have to articulate before I can move on. Because an opportunity, a possibility I see, and I'm thinking of the founders of Netflix. And if I listened to one of them on a podcast, and it was fascinating how they started. So these two guys met each other working at the same company, and they decided they wanted to start a company together. So every day when they commuted to work, they would throw business ideas at each other and then roast them until the one day they were like, what if there wasn't a late fee for these DVD rentals? And how I imagined your digging in the future archaeology is basically this process. So instead of throwing some random business ideas at each other, it's like, oh, let's dig here. Oh, let's dig there. Oh, I found an artifact. And then let's look at this artifact for however long until it falls apart. And we realize, oh, it's not ceramics from the 30th century, but it's just a piece of plastic from yesterday.
Absolutely. I think you framed it perfectly. It's you will ask yourself so many what if questions while digging here, and then no, let's dig over there 2 meters to the left, let's go there. It's this process, and it goes and goes and goes. And yeah, sometimes you find it's like a ceramic, you dig it out and it turns to sand, It's, you never know what will happen.
Yeah. I think you have to write a book. Sorry to say that.
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful method that we could apply in many different ways. So even outside of corporations, there's so many who want to start a business. I mean, at the moment, it's a little bit like the gold digger times, but with AI. Yeah. Everyone wants to start an AI business, but then which direction to go? Because everything develops so fast that the possibility of your business idea to be futile in the next half year is incredibly high.
Yeah. And it's also this thing, in the beginning of our conversation, when I mentioned this thing that I want to achieve with this process, that people who want to then continue pursuing the artifact, that they have something robust in their hand, again, without ever being able to promise absolute robustness, right? I mean, you cannot think of everything, but at least if you follow the principle, at least, of what we discussed in today's discussion, even if you don't call it future archaeology, if you just take some hints from here and you want to start a business, could be an AI or whatever you choose, neurosciences, by making those thoughts and complementing anyway with the trend research you need to do and the business model canvas. And, I think these approaches work beautifully in like complementary, right? This one doesn't say don't do the other. It just, if you do anyway, going from now into the future with, let's say, your AI idea, you'll find out if you'll have biases maybe somewhere, or you took assumptions that are simply not true.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
What I imagine, I would be curious about your experience then working with air quotes professionals in the corporate sector. Because when I imagine myself sitting down and doing this digging, there is something very intrinsic that will prevent me from going there because, oh, I cannot control, it's uncertain. How am I doing this? I haven't done that before. Am I doing it right? Am I imagining the right thing? So I think there are so many limiting beliefs that we cannot control, that we have to outgrow, and that's a maturity process. How do you guide that, and how do you deal with it when your clients or your clients come up with it?
Yeah. So there are actually a couple of things that are in the context of what you just said. It is super important, this question. So when I encounter clients, right, for the first time, and I get a feeling like the openness towards a pluralism in the future is absolutely not there. It's of central importance to kind of like break through that in the beginning. If it doesn't work, the whole process cannot work. That's one. And I need to understand if they are okay with what can come out is unpleasant, maybe from today's perspective. And I learned it very early, actually, when I started in 2014, it was to do this professionally, by at first thinking when my team and I were coming up with an idea and we're like, I think this affects this part of the business or this department. And we tried to get a meeting with them, and we got to the meeting with them. And then they didn't like it. I went back in the beginning, young me, I was like, oh, they didn't like it. Maybe I did something wrong. And then during that time, I heard a very interesting sentence in a TV show. And someone said there, the only one who is liked by everyone is the clown. And I thought, my team and I cannot be the clown of this corporation. It can hurt. It can be contrary to what they want. You cannot be the most popular kid on the playground if you are tasked to think about the future of the corporation.
And you know what? I love that you're saying that because I did a clown workshop years ago, and a good friend of mine is actually also training as a clown. So we think a lot about that. And the clown, everyone likes the clown because the clown doesn't try to be liked. One of the major characteristics of the clown is they don't seek to be liked. They're holding the mirror and they're playing with emotions and they're showing people what's there, but they don't try it.
And I think this clown metaphor, Miriam, I think it's worth thinking about that as a corporation or as people like both of us and like-minded, when we think about uncertainty, future, guiding people, what is the role of what is going on there? And then just to close off this thing with, the companies or the professional environments, the last thing that maybe is important in this context is sometimes in specific contexts, we came up with, let's say, a new idea or an invention in a workshop. And this innovation team was now tasked to present this to the management. The management, at least in my experience, often doesn't directly participate. It's not always the case. Like I said, many times they're like, no, you innovation people are doing that. And then when you're done, you present to me. And then there is one question I see very often, and that is, who else has done this before? Like their competition, for example. And it shows you this mindset that they don't believe in themselves or are not conditioned to think that they can come up with something new. It's so important if you see something new that your first question is not, did anyone else did it or do it already? And there can be multiple reasons. Can be either because they want to know, are the others successful by doing that? And on the other side, the fear of if there is no one else and I'm the first one who will do this, what is that? Yeah, it's scary. And what is it? I can be attacked if it doesn't go well. And sometimes people in power, they don't like that. They don't want to be attackable, if that is even a word.
Yeah. And it reminds me of this phenomenon that if you hire McKinsey, it's usually the safe bet, because even if they fuck it up, it doesn't work out when they do it. Everyone like, oh, nobody could have done it. So instead of taking maybe a risk and someone who comes in with an innovative idea. So
yeah, it can be a buffer, right? Because then you can say, I took my decision. based on this research from one of the big five, for example. And you can basically, you can offload your responsibility, right? And sometimes it's even expected from senior managers to act like that. But again, I would ask myself how many people with that mindset, if you want to call this the mindset they have, are the ones who moved something in the world.
And I think you cannot.
You cannot. I think so too.
Because you're aiming to first mover innovation, but within a box.
Yeah.
Within a sandbox that has with clear guardrails of what has been tried before. And I think it's inherently contradictory. So
yeah. And also what happened to some companies who pursued this approach, when you look at again history, is when you do that too long, and these consulting firms consult many other competitors of yours as well, and you never question it or come up with your own thing, what can happen, doesn't need to happen, but can happen, is that you will make yourself indistinguishable over time of the others, because everyone bases their decision on the same thing, more or less. And then from a client perspective, you're like, firm A and firm B in the same sector, what's the difference now, right? Yeah. Where they may have been super different when the founder started.
And I think that's exactly what we're observing at the moment.
Yeah, me too.
On the level of corporations and brands, that, maybe they have a slightly different branding, so they speak to different consumers, and at some point they will merge because they realize that their profits will be higher.
Yeah.
And we can even see it on the level of freelancers and individual brands, that too much of same because it's scary to stand out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I don't know whether it was Seth Godin, must have been him, who said, if your strength is to conform and to deliver, then work for someone. If your strength is to stand out, then work for yourself. But don't try to stand out working for a corporate, and don't try to conform when you're by yourself.
And I am not sure if I would sign off on that, by the way, Miriam. Yeah. So let's put it that way. I think it's in itself absolutely right. But I didn't leave the corporate contexts because of that. I think in the big corporate context I was in, I think I navigated myself probably unintentionally in my role, because I probably said here and there something off, the path. But what I really appreciated I worked for 2 large firms, like really large firms. The challenges they tackle are amazing. And for a person, at least like me, I liked the complexity a lot, right? That now being by myself with my own has other complexities, but I love complexities in corporations that struggle. I really love them. And I think there's something very interesting to solve a really big problem for a really large corporation. I really like that. But you're absolutely right with what you said. And I would really sign off. I just think it can be looked at differently.
Yeah, true. Because the large corporates, if everyone is just conforming, then they're prone to fail very quickly.
Absolutely. And those who can stand out and are there in this management circle or meeting or at the right time in this right place and say, and have the courage, because there's always this thing, or maybe that's your last day in this corporation, but to say, hey, I have this idea. What about this?
Yeah, that have the courage. And then does the company provide the psychological safety?
Yeah.
Or the culture, the context, however you want to call it, for this person who dares to stand out in a corporate, to actually stand up and voice that without them having their head chopped off.
Yes, right. In corporate context where basically you're fired because you do that is probably also not the context I am referring to, because there are no possibilities to do what I was just describing. Yeah. So not every large corporation is like what I experienced. I am absolutely aware, but the right big corporations have amazing problems. like fascinating problems.
Yeah.
I love them. I really love them. Yeah.
And then that's a mindset to see these challenges in a positive way as, oh, there's something we can solve instead of the threat from the future.
Yes, there are opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Right. Like in Star Trek, Mr. Spock. Fascinating.
Yeah. And I was wondering actually whether these scenarios, the artifacts could actually be, you could repurpose all these ideas into science fiction novels.
Absolutely.
Or find artifacts in science fiction novels. Because many of the Star Trek things, when you look at the artifacts that they're using, you can think, oh, do we have that already? Is this something that is more likely nowadays? So it's a treasure trove of ideas.
Science fiction is an absolute treasure trove. And Star Trek in particular is a very good example of artifacts.
Yeah.
And they describe something we actually haven't talked about in this conversation yet, the effect they can have. Because I can speak also there for myself. I was so intrigued by Star Trek as a kid. And there were others, and also others who became physicists because of, I don't know, teleportation in Star Trek or warp drives, like faster than light travel, that they thought, I want to dedicate my career to see if I can contribute to make this happen.
That's future archaeology at work.
It's future archaeology and work, right? And without the sci-fi writer having had the intention.
Yeah.
And I love that kind of science fiction, like Star Trek and similar, as opposed to a science fiction that basically describes the end of the world, which also has its place. But, if I say, hey, Miriam, I have this idea. Shall we do this? And if we succeed, we will make the life of people on planet Earth so miserable. I mean, no one will help us both, right?
Yeah.
So that science fiction for me is on a different bookshelf.
Yeah.
It stimulates something else. But Star Trek and future artifacts that show a corporation or an individual, right, something to pursue can, in the right context, be magical.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also this book in German called Die Risikogesellschaft, the Risk Society. I don't know if it was translated like that.
Oh, yeah, by Schirmacher.
I think it's Ulrich Beck.
Oh, Ulrich Beck. Yes, Ulrich Beck. Sorry. Yes.
Where it says basically, risks are futures that ought not to happen. Right? So where's the space for the futures that ought to happen?
Yeah.
So don't look at risks the whole day when you talk about the future, because then you only look at stuff that shouldn't happen.
And you're limiting your brain, and then, all this self-fulfilling prophecy and the law of attraction will not happen. So we are building walls to our own thinking and creativity unconsciously, basically.
Totally.
Interesting.
Totally. Yeah.
Interesting. I read the book when I studied sociology, and maybe I was too young for that. Now I realize.
I have this effect also sometimes.
I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Back then.
Yeah. Right. It's these things that sometimes, if you change the context, it's like, oh wow, I never thought about it this way. And I also just stumbled across this when I was already developing this method, and I heard all these, we have this risk department and risk. And then it was like, there's this book. What was this again? And I was like, yes, they're just looking at what should not happen, which is important, by the way. I'm not saying not do risk management. But if a company doesn't have the space next to risk management to say, and these people are tasked to look at what should happen.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, you're missing a part.
The yin and the yang.
Maybe. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the complement to the risk department?
And a future archaeological dig site.
Yes. Yes.
Or the future saloons. Oh yeah. Starting by watching Star Trek.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love to host such saloons.
Oh, me too. Me too. Maybe something to be discussed.
Yes, audience, if there's a need.
Right.
What remains your facilitation challenge?
I have two ways how I look at facilitation in my experience. One, sometimes when a journey starts, I wasn't a designated facilitator, and I somehow become the facilitator. I don't know if this has happened to you before or other podcast guests of yours had this, but I sometimes transition from I'm here to attend something to become the facilitator. I think at that moment, because I am somehow with skin in this game, because I was invited to this workshop to contribute with my knowledge, I am a facilitator who already has knowledge to a specific area, right? So my challenge there is when I switch the role to let go of, okay, now I should contribute to the ideation or something. Because for me, when facilitating, and again, I struggle putting that label on me, but when facilitating, when that is the activity I'm doing right now, and the others will be the ones who in the end will have to do the do work. I shouldn't project what I would do or what I could do in there because they need to be comfortable in doing what they do. So I really can only see myself then as guiding and being, I like this English word, or is it Latin, agnostic? I try to be agnostic, right? There's no, I don't have then my own idea in the game anymore. And that is a big challenge for me. If it's crystal clear from the beginning, you're the facilitator, it's not so challenging. But this moment when I transition from an attendee, a participant, to a facilitator and becoming agnostic is for me important and challenging.
Because someone is taking away something from you.
Yeah,
like
because
we get attached.
I had this great idea, now I
get
can't
attached to our ideas and what we are producing, and which is why workshops work.
Yeah,
because we're creating ownership.
Yes,
for the participants.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and this falling in love with an idea is only best when you are in it and you want to do it. Like, for example, this thing I'm working on now for myself and hopefully for my future, if it works out. But if I would be the outside person, I should not buy in the idea.
Yeah, because you're basically helping the group to remain objective and critical and to look at the blind spots. And if you're...
Yeah, have you thought about this?
Yeah.
Did any one of you look at that?
Yeah, good one.
But yeah, this, I don't know if this happened to you, but it's so funny for me when you asked me in the beginning this question with the facilitator, it dawned on me that I had these situations where I wasn't a designated facilitator in the beginning of that journey and became.
Because you do have the skills and the process was chaotic?
Could be. I think even I would actually have to think about that now more and more. Like, really, it just came to my mind that it happened. But yeah, probably like that was one of the reasons, but maybe also a specific knowledge in a specific process step where I could take myself out of the ideation, but I was able to say either how can we quantitatively or qualitatively generate ideas in this context now, and maybe was the most useful person in the context to do that now. But yeah, that's also something interesting. The transition from becoming a facilitator over time within a process already.
Yeah. And I think it is because it is a superpower to steer a group towards a process and to have this meta view on, I can see what is happening right here, right now, even if you're part of it. And I think this perspective is not a given. And then, it can become a risk if you voice that too quickly, that you see it and that you have a solution, that suddenly you have to be responsible for it.
I mean, when I studied computer science, and during that time, I was very idealistic about something called Linux, for those who know in your audience, but doesn't matter, an operating system. And I was super idealistic about it and the whole open source things around it. And I'm still passionate about it. But when switching from a university context to a commercial context in a large corporation that has clients that want maybe a solution from this corporation or this corporation, and you would, even if I would think, oh, but it would be so nice if they would use this open source, I learned that when it comes to now steering the clients who I work with to find the best solution for them, my ideology has no place. No place. And then carrying on through my career and then later future archaeology and workshops and all that stuff, that's something I learned, lucky me, maybe very early, that I need to leave that outside the door. I have my opinion, but that's not my role when I try to find the best solution or help a group to find the best idea for their issues,
Yeah.
right?
And maybe that's another reason why you have to write your book. Because if there is, like for design thinking, for instance, there's a very clear process and everyone could know potentially what needs to be done in order to follow the process, so that either everyone is facilitating, air quotes, the process is facilitating, and they don't need this one person. So once you wrote your book and you have your process, then you can step out of the role of facilitator and participate.
True.
Problem solved.
Yes. I need to think of that, Miriam. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm planting the seed and I'll be your cheerleader.
You do. Oh, yeah. I don't know. Also with the methods, through, now more than 10 years doing this, so many methods I learned, I experienced. I'm really a believer of not taking also here religiously or idealistically one method. For example, design thinking. Design thinking has its spot, but I need to feel that this is now the right thing, because design thinking was sold to me very early as this thing that helps you to shape your future. Work iteratively in this double diamond thing with prototypes, be creative, build something fast, expose the client. Don't need to explain, obviously, design thinking, but I realized in that process that if I don't have the right starting point or the right question,
doomed.
And asking 100 people, 10,000 people on the street about something will not give you the future, because 10,000 random people on the street either do not intrinsically think about the future by themselves, or they repeat what they have heard, what others are saying, what the future of work is, or education, or Bitcoin, or whatever. So what is the quality you get, right? But as if you go with, let's say, what we discussed earlier, the book finds you, something they've never, and then you go and say, how would this feel? And you build a prototype. You get other results of this design thinking process. So for me, it's always so important, not what is the name of the process, but when shall I apply, at what stage is now design thinking good? And for one company, it can be here, and for the other, it should be here, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen some contexts where people thought, oh, I've seen my competitors doing design thinking, let's also do it.
Yeah, it's intriguing what you're saying, because based on our conversation now, the interviewing the personas, design thinking solves today's problems and not tomorrow's problems. So if you're solving today's problems, the moment where you have the solution, the problem is different. And I think this is something the post-VUCA, I now learned it's called the Barney. It's a Barney problem, right? So maybe
this is new to me. Barney.
Barney is about, the A is anxiety, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. Which I find interesting because it's also kind of the internal process. VUCA is only the external, how the world functions. And for me, anxious and brittle is kind of also internal. Anyway, but it sounds as if, the design thinking process has served us until a point where suddenly everything is changing too fast. And maybe I'm reading too much about AI at the moment, because I also want to acknowledge there are industries that are not moving as fast. Yeah. So if you're in an industry that is slower, or you're producing notebooks. Oh, no, that's a bad example. I'm sure that there are examples that don't move that fast. And then design thinking has its place.
Yeah, and I think for sectors that don't move fast, or they look like they don't move fast, I think what is important there, and this comes now back to the saloons, right? I think what they and their leadership need to somehow do, if they would ask me, which they don't, but if they, is to start to see, how can I read the signs of time, die Zeichen der Zeit lesen, right? But not through, like you said, just looking at now problems, or why are we struggling with notebooks or whatever now, but to read the signs of time. I don't know if you say this in English. That, I think, and there's not done a lot of do work. It's a lot of thinking work in those sectors.
And this might be the biggest problem. That we talked about that maybe before we hit the record button. How little thinking time people allow themselves, and how little thinking time we allow ourselves.
Absolutely.
For me, it was easier when I spent the 2 months in Australia, where half of the day, most of the day, nobody was missing me because I was on the other side of the world. So I had a lot of thinking and journaling time. And now I'm back in Amsterdam, and I realized that my calendar suddenly is full, and I don't even know why.
Absolutely. This taking the time, finding the time, and thinking about the future time needs to be a realization at some point, but cannot be forced upon, I guess.
Yeah.
But I would be an advocate for everybody. I think everybody can find a time if they want, I think.
100%. 100%. And then, there's always something we're avoiding if we're not doing it. What is it that you would have loved to have known before, or your advice to your younger self?
I wish, to be honest, to not have stopped creating artworks, if I can even call some of the things I'm doing art, but while I was working for the large corporations. Because I also was on, I don't know what it's called in English, Jugendkunstschule, and I used to love to draw, to, I don't know, sculpt something. And then I got into the big corporate context, and I found a new outlet for myself, which I still pursue, which is photography, which was this thing that was easily doable next to working 100% at a large corporation. But I think I should have looked for the time to continue painting. Because now, since I'm outside that context, I'm doing it again, and I learn so many things by doing so. So taking the time, not just about the future, but giving your creative outlet, and it can be reading for someone else, whatever, really, really the time, because for me, it cross-fertilizes my work.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I realized, by the way, there's something very funny, like 6 years ago, I bought a skateboard. I used to skate when I was a kid. So I was like, let me get a skateboard and let me get to work sometimes with a skateboard. And so the same like route to work was suddenly different. The same thing. I was like, I never paid attention to this. I never paid attention to that. I never paid attention. Why is this here? You know, when you walk, it's like completely, certain things are non-obstacles, or, you know, and just by doing something that had nothing to do with the other, you see other things. I think, metaphorically speaking, I think you will see other things if you don't just look at, you know, the things at hand in your sector or something. That's fascinating for me. Like,
yeah, it is. And I think that's something my girlfriend challenged me when I was in Australia to do something new every day. And as small or as big, going to the same cafe, but then ordering something that I wouldn't have ordered before. Just looking for the small things that could be different. This makes a big change.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then also sci-fi, because you said AI, like Star Trek, there was this TV show, Star Trek Voyager, at some point. And there is an AI that went a little bit crazy because it was a doctor. And there were like two patients coming in with the same like probability of survival, like down to the, I don't know how many dots after the comma, you know. And the doctor saved one of them. And then the AI got into like a spiral of, why did I save this person or not this? You know, what's the reason? And it got really so crazy that they had to delete it. And then it found out again, had to delete it. At some point, they said, you know what, let's put the AI next to a human person 24/7. So they work in shifts. So the AI can just work with humans. And this episode ends by the captain. She's on that sofa. She reads a book. Her shift is over. She gets up, takes the book, leaves it on that chair or sofa, leaves the room. Next person comes in. The AI, in this form like a holodoctor, takes the book up and reads the first page loud, by the way, in the TV show. And then it ends. And it was beautiful what it was reading. And I was like, what is this? And it was La Vita Nuova from Dante. It's a 900-year-old book. And this first page said it all, Miriam. And then I went to Amazon. I bought La Vita Nuova. I was like, what's going on there? And I realized if you read a 900-year-old book, it says things that are tremendously important, even in 2025. Insane. And this is I would have never found it because it's not in the library of an innovation manager or some incubation hub, right? And some sci-fi writer found this and kind of like pre-curated this. And since then, I'm reading all kinds of these things because I discovered there's a treasure trove of things that people have written about people that work even if we have TikTok or not, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yes. And we totally underestimate the impact and value of reading fiction.
Yes. Yes.
There's for creativity, for empathy, for imagination.
Yeah. And also old books like Dante's La Vita Nuova, which is not fiction, but it says so much about the human, you know. You probably know the Divine Comedy, or you have heard of it, right? I mean, that was his last book, and La Vita Nuova is, I think, his first. So he wrote stuff in between, but in La Vita Nuova, he describes how he met Beatrice, who then when at the end of his life, he closed the bracket, basically. So if you find the time, it's beautiful if you want to read it. And it goes between like poems and normal texts back and forth.
I will check it out.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Markus. What a beautiful conversation exploration.
Thank you. And likewise, thank you for having me on your show. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for staying tuned and for listening until the very end. I hope that you found the inspiration and the wisdom that you are looking for. And I hope that you will subscribe to the show so that you never miss any of the interviews with another inspiring facilitator from across the world. I'm devoted to continue this podcast and to deliver weekly an episode that maintains the quality that you expect and you deserve. And if you would like to help me to maintain this quality and to keep the podcast free, please help us. Visit workshops.work/support to make a small donation to keep the podcast free. Thank you so much. I hope to be in your ears next week.